Well, anyone who comes in now is late. Hi, I'm Kurt Eichenwald, and I am the author of a book called The Informant, which is about events that took place here. This is the story of the investigations of the conspiracies at the Archer Daniels Midland Company and the ultimate bizarre tale that spun out from that. Now, I'm really glad to see so many of you here because basically for the last 5 years I've been your neighbor. I've been sitting next to you, at lunch. I've been down at Huck's buying myself a Diet Coke. I've been driving all over town. I've been taking a trip between Decatur and Springfield and back again, and then down to Champaign and back over. So as a result, I kind of feel like I've been living here myself. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about what I was trying to do with this book, what it tells us, and read you a few things that I think underscore that. Now, to do that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am an investigative reporter at the New York Times, which is a big fancy word that basically means, I look at things real hard for a long time. And in that job, I've had the opportunity to see some of the more interesting corporate cases that have come up over the years. And I kept noticing a trend. Like, I would write about a corrupt law firm. A year or so later, John Grisham would publish The Firm. And I would write about a corrupt insurance company. And a year or so later, John Grisham would publish Rainmaker. Now, I didn't write about the tobacco companies, but a colleague of mine did. And a year or so later, John Grisham wrote Runaway Jury. And I read a news article where John Grisham said, I get all my ideas from the newspaper. And I thought, why is John Grisham getting to have all the fun? And when you think about it, John Grisham, brilliant. He is writing business stories. He is writing thrillers based in the business world. And I stopped and scratched my head and thought, he's very right. These stories are thrilling. These stories are exciting. And maybe I should try to write one, but instead of making it up, I'll tell a true story. I'll just write it the way a novelist would write it. I'll write a thriller in novel form that happens to be true. Well, almost at the very moment I had that thought, a fellow named Mark Whitaker burst onto the national stage. Now, everybody here, who doesn't know who Mark Whitaker is? Yeah, I thought so. Since we're speaking near Mark Whitaker's hometown in the store where he bought his books, everybody here knows. But we do have a camera here for people outside of the Decatur and Forsyth area. So Mark Whitaker was a senior executive at a company everybody here knows, the Archer Daniels Midland Company, which is a company that makes the grains and fibers and oils and additives that we find in virtually every food we eat. I mean, it's in everything from popsicles to pepperoni, from Gerber baby food to Kellogg's Corn Flakes. They're everywhere. I mean, you have a Coke, a Pepsi, or a 7-Up, you're getting some ingredients from ADM. And Whitaker was their golden boy. Whitaker was a fellow who was a rising star, a man who had great promise there, a very young man. But he also had a number of other lives. The one that was known about first was Whitaker was the highest ranking informant ever to work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the whole time that he was, for many of the years, for 2.5 years, during the time that he was working for ADM, he was simultaneously walking around inside the company, wearing tape recorders inside his pocket, strapped to his back, and hidden inside his briefcase, video cameras hidden inside of lamps, and recording everything that was going on inside. Because Whitaker had a number of secrets. But the one that was the biggest at that point was that ADM was engaged in a series of international conspiracies to rig the prices with competitors of some of those ingredients we ultimately find in our food products. That alone sounds like a great possibility for a Grisham story. That alone, or in fact, it sounds very similar to something that Scott Turow just wrote in Personal Injuries. But there was one more element that made this story more bizarre than anything I could ever imagine, more bizarre than anybody could imagine, was that the entire time Whitaker was working for the FBI, he was also gradually losing his mind. He was a man that no one knew was becoming very psychologically disturbed and was having a great deal of trouble telling the difference between what was real and what was not. As a result, a lot of people, the FBI, the Justice Department, the American media, started following down trails, some of which were real, some of which were not. Now, when I first heard about this story, and over the months and years that I continued working on it for the New York Times, eventually I realized this was the perfect story. This was the perfect nonfiction novel. Because you had in this story, in one place, the CIA, the FBI, international conspiracies, money laundering, Swiss bank accounts, suicide attempts, corporate espionage through the use of prostitutes, campaign finance violations, political power, on and on and on and on and on, reaching all the way up to the offices of Janet Reno and Louis Freeh at the Justice Department and the FBI. I couldn't possibly think of a better story. And so I set about attempting to capture that. Now, if you're trying to write this story as a novel, that's true. The biggest problem would be, how do you write it? Well, fortunately, the one thing I like about this, I got to throw this out. Liz Smith, the gossip columnist, took a look at the book, and she described it yesterday, so I think I succeeded. She described it yesterday as John Grisham on acid. And I don't get any of the credit for that. I get the credit for being able to put it all on paper. But honestly, it's all true. But it is John Grisham on acid. To put the structure together, the first thing I had to do was go back and look at the novels I liked. Go back and look at the nonfiction books I liked, the narrative nonfiction books I liked. And I read book after book after book, underlining little devices they use. How did they get the pacing right? How did they keep my interest? How is it that I was able to read this book and not put it down all night long? Then I went back and read a lot of books that I didn't like, figuring what was it that they did wrong? What was it that didn't work? And ultimately had an idea of how to structure it. The single most important thing I realized in almost every book that worked was detail. Pacing was important, pacing was good, but detail was the most important element. You were able to see everything that was happening. There were no walls. If somebody went into a room and closed the door, you kept going with them, and you knew what kind of door it was, and what kind of rug it was, and what kind of desk it was. And so detail was the secret of this story. To get that level of detail meant that I had to engage in some of the strangest interviews I have ever participated in. There have been times I have sat with people and they have told me the story of the most difficult day in their professional career, how they sat down with a colleague and realized that they were concerned that the institution they worked for was not doing things the right way, and as they sat there over lunch, anguished over whether they could continue working in their job. And I followed up with the question, and what were you eating for lunch? Sometimes people got very frustrated with me, but ultimately I ended up with the detail I needed to tell the story. Now, there was a second problem. That being, this was a story where many, many people lied. This was a story where many of those lies found their way into records, into documents, into print, There were allegations, completely false allegations, that were made against honorable people that were printed up. There were stories that left everyone confused. How do you figure out what's real in a world where everybody is telling a lie, or almost everybody? For that, I knew I needed to not just be a novelist, but also be an investigative reporter. I needed to obtain the records. I needed to obtain the transcripts of the tapes that Whitaker had recorded. I needed to obtain other records from within the government that would allow me to describe what happened there. I needed to call every single person I could find who played a significant role in this case and push them to talk to me. I needed to sit down with those people and run through it and compare what they said to the documents that I could find, and eventually blend that all together into one long narrative. But then the next level, telling this story is so confusing in a way that will allow people to understand it. So I had to take a step back. I had to think about this. How do you tell the story the right way? And this was the most important decision I made. In this case, it was easy to think, who's the hero? Maybe it's the man who wore the recorder. A lot of people thought that at one point. A lot of people at one point thought Mark Whitaker was a hero. Maybe it's the prosecutors. Maybe not. I decided in the end there were really only one group of heroes here, people who dedicated their lives to this effort, people who, regardless of how tough it became in pursuing this case to justice, never let up. And that was the agents, the field agents of the FBI. These are people who worked long hours for not a lot of money and did so solely for one reason. They were interested in pursuing justice. The answer became obvious. How do I tell this story? I tell this largely from the perspective of the FBI. I tell this from the perspective of, you find out what's going on about the same time they find out what's going on. Now, I'm not going to leave you completely surprised. I'm not going to raise something that I gave no indication of. You'll get hints along the way. But for the most part, you're going to find out things as the FBI finds them out. What that means as a result is the book becomes something of a Chinese puzzle. You open a door, you find another door. I'm never telling you where truth is and where it isn't until the book finally reaches its end. At that point, people in this community in particular are going to find out everything you wanted to know about what really happened in this case. All of the confusion is stripped away. All of the false stories are stripped away. And you end up with a reality, a version of reality that is backed up by about as much reporting as I could humanly do. And hopefully that falls into the realm of what I was trying to accomplish. So the story we have, the story we tell, is the story of Mark Whitaker. Mark Whitaker working with the FBI, the FBI pursuing this case. The FBI trying to find out how ADM was working with its competitors to rig prices. In this case, in a product called lysine. It's an amino acid that's used to fatten up pigs and chickens. Probably everybody here knows that, right? So you have the first day. I'm going to read a few scenes from the book. Has everybody here read the book, or am I just going to bore them? No? Well, not, some heads nod, not a lot nod, so that's okay. I'm going to read you a few scenes from the book. Now, I should tell you, I'm a little bit anxious here, because as I'm looking around the room, I've seen a few people who are in the book. So,
We don't want you to ruin it for us.
nobody jump up and say that's not what happened. Mark Whitaker began this event by telling a story. He came to ADM one day and said, I received a telephone call. I received a telephone call from an engineer at a Japanese corporation, one of our competitors. And that engineer told me that we have a saboteur in our plant. And that saboteur is contaminating the plant and making it so it can't work. He told this to Mick Andreas, the vice chairman of ADM. And in no time, ADM alerted the Central Intelligence Agency. Said, we've got a problem out here. This saboteur is out here, this man who called us, this engineer, he's demanding $10 million to identify the saboteur and to give us the ability to fight off these viruses they're using to contaminate our plant. Well, the CIA doesn't have authority to deal with that kind of situation, so the CIA called the FBI. Eventually it arrives at the FBI in Chicago, which called the FBI in Springfield, which called the FBI agent in Decatur, Illinois, Brian Shepard. And Brian Shepard came out, interviewed Mark Whitaker, interviewed Mick Andreas, found out more about this engineer, found out more about this contamination of the plant. And Whitaker was saying he was getting phone calls at his house, phone calls from this Japanese engineer who was demanding the $10 million. So Brian Shepard made an appointment to come out to Mark Whitaker's house to put a tape recorder on that phone to catch this Japanese engineer and get the proof that this extortion attempt, which is really what it was going on. Earlier that night, Mark and Ginger Whitaker went out to dinner. And that's this scene. Ginger Whitaker stepped into the crowded formal dining room at the Country Club of Decatur and looked for her husband. It was just after 6 p.m. that same day. Most of the tables were filled, but Ginger found Mark and his guests quickly. He saw her clad in one of her nicest dresses and stood to greet her. The dinner had been planned for some time. An ADM vendor was visiting Decatur with his wife. Whitaker had a close relationship with the man. After hearing the family enjoyed horses, the vendor had presented the Whitakers with an expensive riding saddle. Dinner was relaxed and elegant, with wine and laughter flowing freely. Late in the meal, Ginger excused herself to make a trip to the ladies' room. As she stood, placing her napkin on the table, Mark reached out with a business card in his hand. "Here's that phone number you wanted," he said. Ginger smiled as she took the card, uncertain what her husband was talking about. She headed past the dining room's entryway and looked in her palm. She was holding one of Mark's business cards for ADM. She flipped the card over and felt her heart drop as she read words written in Mark's familiar scrawl. "The FBI is coming by the house tonight at 10 o'clock. Our house." Ginger felt a chill. Over the past 2 days, Mark had given her some hints about what was bothering him. Nothing in much detail, but enough to worry her. She had hoped that the previous day's interview was going to be the end of it. Now some agent would be coming out to their home, standing with them, probably asking them questions. Ginger could not think of the last time she was so frightened. They leave dinner, they go out to their cars, they drive home in separate cars because Whitaker has to take home the vendor. As she's driving along, suddenly, the phone rings in Ginger Whitaker's car. She knew it was Mark calling from his car. He had just dropped off their guest and finally had a chance to talk. "This is really going to be something," Mark said over the car speaker, sounding terribly nervous again. "I don't know what to do." "I know what you're going to do. You're going to tell the truth." "You don't understand. These guys are more powerful than the government. I'm more scared of ADM than I am of the FBI." "If I were you, I'd be more fearful of the FBI," Ginger replied. "You don't mess with the FBI. ADM's nothing compared with the FBI." But as far as Ginger was concerned, ADM was just another company. Mark said she didn't understand how powerful ADM was and what it could do. "I could tell Brian Shepard everything I know, and tomorrow morning I'll probably be fired from ADM. And they're a lot more powerful than the government." Ginger sighed. "Mark, you only have one choice. Don't worry about ADM. You have to tell everything." Ginger paused as she pulled onto Main Street in Mowequa. Her husband's nervousness had made her more wary. "Mark," she said gently, trying to mask her concern, "have you broken the law?" Whitaker was quick to answer. "No," he said, "I haven't broken the law at all." Well, That's the moment of tension as they're building up to it. Brian Shepard doesn't know this is going on. As far as he's concerned, he's just going to go drop off, set up that recorder, and leave. About 10 p.m., Shepard approached a blinking red light in the center of Moequa. He turned right, passing a series of modest homes. As he headed west, large maple trees and bushes obscured Whitaker's house. The two-story home, with multiple white awnings, pillars, and decks, was visible only in spots where dense foliage had never grown. Finally, the bright interior lights of the house cut through the darkness. Shepard turned onto the driveway, passing a black gate supported by brick pillars. Inside, Mark and Ginger were upstairs in the master bedroom, where they had continued discussing the impending FBI visit for another half an hour. Mark had opened up a bit, telling her details of what he knew. Ginger was more convinced that he should talk. "Just tell them everything," she said. "We'll just leave. I don't like what this company is doing to you. This is a chance to go somewhere else." Mark, sitting on the bed, looked up at her. "I may tell them at some point, but not right now. Right now, I'm going to follow the company line." Ginger's face was a mask of determination. "Mark, if you don't tell them, I will." The room fell silent. Mark stared at her. He wasn't ready. He needed more time. "I can't," he said softly. "Not now." Brian Shepard pulls up to the house. He comes in, he introduces himself, goes upstairs, hooks up that recorder, and is getting ready to leave. Ginger's been listening in and realizes that Mark never said a thing. Shepard had returned to the front door, thanking the Whitakers for their time. Mark opened the door and Shepard walked out, crossing the porch toward his car. Inside the doorway, Ginger looked at her husband. "Are you going to say something?" she asked softly. "Or am I?" Mark didn't respond and started closing the door. Shepard had almost reached his car. Ginger turned away from her husband. She shoved past him, pushing open the door and heading outside. "Brian!" Shepard turned when Mark called his name. "Yes?" Mark took a few steps outside. "Do you have a minute?" And that was it. That was the moment, the beginning. In the 5 hours that followed, Mark Whitaker sat in Brian Shepard's car telling a story almost beyond belief. That the company he was working for was engaging in this international conspiracy to rig prices, basically to rip us off, to cause the price of products that food companies buy to be higher than they otherwise would if there was real competition. It was a massive allegation of a massive fraud, a fraud that that, if successful, would drive people in this area, this community, out of business. People running small feed stores wouldn't be able to afford the ingredients they needed to run their business. If true, this was one of the biggest such conspiracies ever found by the FBI. Over time, it became evident that it was true. For that, I'm going to go to one of my favorite scenes here. One that takes place at a place you guys might know. It's called the Hickory Point Mall. That's where we are right now. If you know, there's a whole slew of hotels down there, and it took that place just down the road. So if anybody hears anything familiar, you know, that's why. North of Decatur, at the intersection of Interstate 72 and Route 51, lies the village of Forsyth. Founded in 1854 as the spikes were being driven for the Illinois Central Railroad, Forsyth had long been little more than an appendage to Decatur. But beginning in the 1970s, a boom in economy hotels there followed the construction of the Hickory Point Mall. Forsyth soon emerged as a frequent stop for budget-minded travelers. By the summer of 1993, the Forsyth hotels had also become popular spots for the FBI's meetings with Mark Whitaker. Storm clouds were gathering on the evening of July 13th as Bob Herndon, another agent on the case, drove his bureau car to Forsyth. After more than a month on the case, tonight he would meet Whitaker for the first time. Herndon put on his blinker when he saw the brown and white sign for the mall. He drove into the entrance and made a quick right. Ahead was the Hampton Inn, his destination. After parking, Herndon threw a floor mat over his red bubble light and stuffed his radio microphone under the seat. He didn't want passers-by to wonder why law enforcement was up at the hotel. Upstairs, his partners were waiting. The three agents spent a few minutes testing the telephone recording equipment they wanted to use that night. Shepard and Herndon took off their guns, putting them in their briefcases. There was no reason to make Whitaker uncomfortable. Their witness arrived about 45 minutes later. By then, a torrential downpour had begun. "Hey, how you doing?" Whitaker said as he walked inside the room. He's a lot more chipper now than he was before, shaking off the rain. He glanced around. Weatherall, the other agent on the case, was sitting on a couch. On the bed, Whitaker saw a young, athletic-looking man he did not know. "Mark, this is Special Agent Bob Herndon," Shepard said. "Like I told you, he's transferred from another office and been assigned to the case." Whitaker broke into a smile. "Hey, it's nice to meet you. Great to have you here." There's some chit-chatting as everyone's having a good time, meeting each other. Whitaker turns over his tapes. Then finally they say, there's a call they want him to make. They want him to call a fellow in Japan. The FBI wants to videotape the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Americans as they engage in this conspiracy. Their hope is they'll have the rock-solid evidence to prove the conspiracy. As long as the meetings are in Paris or in Vancouver or in Mexico City, the FBI doesn't have the authority to videotape. But they've got to lure the Japanese and the Koreans to America. And they've been wrestling with how to do it. They finally came up with an idea. Golf. They would use the exciting world of golf in Hawaii to bring these conspirators into the United States. Now, these are, what you're about to hear, the actual words that were said during this telephone call. This is from the government transcript of this recording. So, listen to it carefully, because you're going to hear what an astonishingly skilled informant, cooperating witness that Whitaker was. Listen as he starts drawing out the other guy and keeps trying to get him to come to the United States. "Put it on my calling card?" Whitaker asked as he picked up the telephone. "Yeah," Shepard said. It was 20 minutes later. Sitting on the bed, Whitaker dialed the number for Kanji Momoto at Ajinomoto, the ADM's Japanese competitor. He had rehearsed the conversation several times and was ready to suggest the Hawaii proposal. The recording device was hooked up to the phone. "It's ringing," Whitaker told the agents. A woman answered. "Yes, may I speak to Mr. Momoto, please?" "I'm sorry, he's in a meeting now, but he'll be free at noon. He told me if he's in a meeting to call him out of the meeting, that it's very important." The woman asked for his name. Whitaker waited on hold until the phone clicked. "Hello? Is this Mr. Tani in New York or Mr. Momoto?" Whitaker was still using Momoto's code name for the conspiracy. Momoto chuckled. "Mr. Tani speaking, yes." "Well, how are you?" Whitaker asked. "Is it Mark speaking?" "This is Mark Tani speaking," Whitaker replied. "Yeah," Momoto laughed. "Mark Tani. They're having a good old time." The two men discussed the possible effects of a planned price increase. ADM, Whitaker said, was concerned about drying up demand. "Remember in Vancouver," Whitaker continued, "Terry Wilson made this very clear that we'll want to try to keep the level of lysine usage as high as we can." "Yeah, that's right." "Not to get the prices too high where we shrink the market," Whitaker said. "Yeah," Momoto replied. "If we shrink the market, of course, we have to avoid such a price increase." Whitaker glanced over at the agents. The time had come to lay the trap. "Since you guys hosted the Vancouver meeting, I think ADM should host the next meeting, don't you?" "Yeah," Momoto said. "That's fine. And maybe we host it in Maui." "Maui?" "You know, have the group meeting like we had last time in Vancouver. Have it in Maui, Hawaii." "Maui, Hawaii is still in the United States," Momoto said warily. Whitaker had been told to push Momoto if he objected, to force him to explain why he didn't want to meet on American territory. He glanced at Shepard. "Yeah, but what's that mean, still in the United States?" he said. "Well," Momoto said, "still in the United States means United States is very severe for the control of antitrust activity, no?" Whitaker's eyes lit up. That statement was going to be almost impossible to explain away. He brushed aside Momoto's concerns. Hawaii, next to an 18-hole golf course, he said. Momoto laughed. If your company judges no problem, maybe I will consult with our legal department. Whitaker reminded him that the previous year, when the price-fixing scheme was in its nascent stages, there had been a meeting in Maui. Well, Momoto said, maybe the meeting could be held in Hawaii to establish the Lysine Association, the one that the conspirators were using for cover. Yeah, that's right, Whitaker said, picking up the theme. It'd be a formal association meeting. And also would be a good distance for you and us both together. Yeah, that's right, Momoto said. And we get to be on the golf course. Yeah, Whitaker replied. No big problem, Momoto said. That was it. Momoto had taken the bait. Now, that proved to be a little too quickly decided. The Japanese backed out. Hawaii and golf kept being dangled in front of them until finally they accepted it. Finally, they came. That was not for almost another year later. Now, as Whitaker was continuing to work with the FBI and continuing to work with ADM, he was getting more and more reckless. He was beginning to take chances that otherwise rational people wouldn't take. There came a time when he was sitting in a hotel room, a Marriott hotel room in Irvine, California, meeting with two executives from Ajinomoto and accompanied by none other than Mick Andreas, the vice chairman of ADM, the man who was there to help establish the final rules needed for the price fixing to take effect. And then Whitaker, what no one knew, I should explain, what no one knew was that the entire meeting was being videotaped. Brian Shepard was not far away, looking at a monitor as a video camera hidden inside a lamp was capturing everything that was going on. Whitaker also had a briefcase with him, among other recording devices. A briefcase that had hidden behind a secret panel a recording device. But then something happened. Now, this book is written sometimes in a quick cutting way where you're jumping from scene to scene. You have three groups of people happening here. Mark Whitaker, Brian Shepard, and Mick Andreas. I will change my position depending on whose perspective we're in. Whitaker walked away from the easel they were using to describe all their numbers and sat down. His briefcase was in front of him on the table. Wait a minute, what was that? A click. Whitaker had definitely heard a click in his briefcase. Andreas turned his back to Whitaker, looking at the easel. There it is again. The briefcase was making a noise. What if the others heard something? Whitaker reached down and turned the case slightly away from the other three executives. He popped open the latches. Shepard watched the monitor intently. Andreas was speaking. I would suggest we do the following, Andreas said. Andreas was on the verge of making his proposal. In his excitement, Shepard was paying no attention to Whitaker. The agent didn't notice that his witness had begun fiddling with the hidden panel in his briefcase. Whitaker tugged on the panel. A small amount of Velcro pulled apart, but the panel stayed in place, slightly farther from the recorder. Maybe that would stop the noise. He shut the briefcase. I'd suggest you tell the people that whatever they have in 93, they can each have 2,000 more in 94, Andreas said, and we get the rest between you and us. Ikeda from Ajinomoto, still holding the pen, looked confused. We have to give some specific number, he said. Whatever their number is in 93, Andreas said, then we can agree to split the rest. There it was. Shepard had heard it. Andreas had just proclaimed that he was setting volumes for every lysine competitor, dictating sales for companies that weren't even in the room. This was dynamite evidence. Click. There it was again. Whitaker looked up and saw everyone was at the easel. He opened his briefcase and gave the panel another tug. More Velcro tore. Whitaker shut the case and looked up. Andreas was just a few feet away, walking straight toward him. Shepard had noticed nothing about Whitaker. His witness sounded calm and in control. He had really come through this time. The group was on the verge of a deal. Shepard watched as Andreas stepped out toward the bathroom. The two Ajinomoto executives stayed in front of the easel, speaking in Japanese about Andreas's proposal. Click! Whitaker decided he had to do something drastic. Somebody would definitely hear this. How in the world would he explain noises coming out of his briefcase? Whitaker scanned the room. Andreas was still in the bathroom. Ikeda and Yamada were talking to each other. No one was paying any attention to him. He opened the briefcase again and pulled hard on the panel. The Velcro tore. Whitaker lifted it up and looked at the recording device inside. If anyone came up behind Whitaker at that moment, they would see it. I'll stop there. Now, as everyone here knows, Whitaker was not, or I believe everyone here knows, Whitaker was not simply getting risky. Whitaker was cracking under the pressure. Whitaker was a man with a psychiatric condition no one knew about, which was gradually getting worse and worse as the days moved on. The only person who was seeing all of the evidence of it was his wife, Ginger. Ginger Whitaker almost didn't recognize her husband anymore. Throughout their marriage, he had made this family a priority. He always had made time to raise rabbits with their youngest son for 4-H Club and attended all the children's school shows. But now, between ADM and the FBI, the family seemed last on the list. One night, she argued with him about his absences. She needed him home more, she told him. His children needed him. She needed him. "I'm doing all this for you and the children," he protested. "I want to give you guys everything. That's why I'm working so much. It's for the family." Ginger took a breath. Mark's tone was snippy. He'd always been so bubbly and happy. These days was often just unpleasant and tired. "Mark, this isn't for the family," she said. "We don't need all these things." "What, you want to be like, what you, blah, excuse me. What, you want to be somebody living in some small house?" he snapped. "You want to be like those people who can't afford cars for their kids?" Ginger felt taken aback. It sounded as though he thought that money made him superior to people with smaller incomes. Something inside him had changed. "You're not better than somebody else because you have more cars or a bigger salary," she said. "It had nothing to do with what kind of person you are." She paused. "You used to know that," she said softly. "You used to know what mattered. You need to find that out again. You need to turn back to God." Mark glared at her. "I don't need God," he said. "I've got more power than God." This is a man who's changing, who's dramatically changing. But he's continuing to work for the FBI. In the years that followed, Whitaker and the FBI, Brian Shepard, Bob Herndon, and their supervisors, put together a great case. They captured these conspirators on tape doing virtually everything. There's a wonderful scene, which unfortunately is too long, so I'm not going to read it. I'll just summarize it, where everyone's joking about who might be attending the next price-fixing meeting. And they say, well, maybe some of our customers will be coming. Ha, 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 ha. You know, price-fixing humor. And then we'll have one from ConAgra and one from another customer. And one of the conspirators looks straight at Mark Whitaker and says, and we'll have one from the FBI. Little do they realize the FBI is watching this scene unfold because it's taking place in Atlanta. But before the meeting began, there had been a problem with Whitaker's briefcase. The FBI was desperately working to fix it. They had just finished fixing it and decided to bring it over to Whitaker. So as they're joking about the FBI and the Federal Trade Commission coming to the room, there's a knock on the door, and one of the executives says, "Yes? FTC?" Federal Trade Commission. But it wasn't the FTC. It was the FBI. And Special Agent Herndon, posing as a hotel employee, passes Whitaker his briefcase, saying, "I believe you left this in the lobby." And in comes this recording device in front of everybody as they all sit there and laugh and joke about how funny it is that this briefcase he'd left downstairs hadn't been stolen yet. The evidence was fabulous. The evidence was fabulous. It's unlike anything I've ever witnessed. But there was a problem. The whole time Mark Whitaker was helping to gather this fabulous evidence, he had a number of other secrets of his own. The biggest, not the biggest, one of the first that came out was that he had been telling people. He had been going around inside ADM and saying, don't tell anyone, but there's a criminal investigation of price fixing, and I'm the cooperating witness. I've lost count of how many people were told. It was something like 8 or 9. It is amazing this case was never disclosed. There were people on the night of the raids when the FBI was going out to put out their search warrants and to do the confrontational interviews who were at home eating dinner, waiting, checking their watch. They're supposed to be here any minute. Whitaker told me they're coming at 6. Oh, there they are. And as they're being interviewed, a few of them say, oh, yeah, I knew all about this. Mark told me. This is a problem. This is a big problem for the FBI. Over the next few weeks, problem after problem after problem emerges, until finally the biggest problem of them all comes out. ADM's attorneys, who by that time have figured out that Mark Whitaker was the informant in this case, arrive in Washington to the senior levels of the Justice Department with a big black notebook. And in that notebook are checks and wire transfers and all sorts of other material. And they say, guess what, guys? While your cooperating witness was working for you, he was also embezzling $2.5 million from ADM. The target of your investigation has been ripped off by your informant. That's a problem. That's a big problem. And then came some of the worst decisions by the government. The government breaks the case in half. They decide, because ADM's lawyers make some ridiculous allegations against the agents in the case, that Brian Shepard and Bob Herndon can no longer be involved. They bring in a whole new crew, people who don't know who Whitaker is, people who are simply looking at Whitaker as a target. Information is not shared between the two investigations. Leads are lost. Problems develop. Shepard is in the position of watching his not even being able to talk to his witness anymore. The case, the antitrust case is having problems. The fraud case is having problems. And Whitaker, now the subject of massive media attention, the target of a criminal investigation, watching his case fall away, completely cracks up. These are going to be the last 2 scenes I read. And begins lying to everyone. This is a scene where he's meeting with his lawyer, a fellow by the name of Jim Epstein. They're about to go meet with the Justice Department and explain all this money that ended up in Mark Whitaker's Swiss and Cayman Islands and Hong Kong bank accounts. I want to know everything you did, Epstein said, looking at Whitaker sternly. I want to know who you did it with, when you did it, and what evidence you have of it. Whitaker nodded. Epstein had been told that prosecutors from the fraud section, which was prosecuting the Whitaker case, wanted to meet him on Monday, August 7th. The idea made Epstein horribly uncomfortable, but Whitaker was determined to attend and explain everything. He felt sure the government would understand. Now, Mark, if you're not prepared to tell the truth and tell everything, then we're better off not going, Epstein said. It would be better not to go than to leave out one detail, or, God forbid, say something you know is wrong. It'll just get you in deeper and deeper. I understand, Whitaker said. I'm going to tell the truth. For hours, Epstein and his partner debriefed Whitaker. He provided numerous details of his financial activities. One scheme involving a $2.5 million check made out to a company called ABP had been hatched with another executive, he said. I didn't get all of that money, Whitaker said. $1 million of it went to Lennart Thorstenson, the president of ABP. Why did he get the money, Mark? Epstein said. He was the guy behind it. $1 million of it was for him. As they finished the briefing, Epstein was less comfortable than when they had begun. The story had a lot of holes. Mark, this just isn't convincing me, Epstein said. I don't believe it. I swear I'm telling you the truth. They're going to tear you apart on this. I don't think you should go in because I don't believe it. I want to go. I got to tell them. Finally, Epstein relented. As a lawyer, his job was to give advice. He couldn't stop a client who insisted on destroying himself. They go and they meet with the FBI. As they're walking in the door, Mark Whitaker turns to his lawyer, Jim Epstein, and says, I haven't been telling you the truth. I'll straighten it out in there. Epstein grabs Whitaker, tries to turn him around and push him out the door, but Whitaker goes, no, I'm going to tell the story, and sits down. Epstein sits down in a position which he has never been in, about to listen to his client tell the people trying to put him in jail what happened, and he doesn't know what the truth is yet. He tells a completely different story, and they leave the room. There's a break. Whitaker headed with his lawyers to another room. Epstein closed the door and turned toward his client. The lawyer's cool facade collapsed, replaced by open dismay. Mark, what is this? He asked sharply. What about Lennart Thorstensen from ABP? Whitaker shrugged. He had nothing to do with this, he said evenly. Nothing to do with this, Epstein repeated, throwing up his hands. You were saying before this guy stole $1 million. Now he had nothing to do with it? For a second, Whitaker seemed to consider Epstein's words. Well, I didn't like Lennart very much, he said softly. Epstein sank into a chair. Well, Mark, he said, if Thorstensen knew you almost implicated him in $1 million theft he had nothing to do with, I'm sure he wouldn't like you very much either. The lies from Mark Whitaker continue on and on and on into this case. I'm not going to tell you what they are. Because the more I tell you, unfortunately, the fewer doors you run into. You're going to start to know things that you're not supposed to know. This is, in a way, a mystery, a game. I'm playing with you. I am putting you in the position of the FBI. I am putting you in the position where you don't know what's real and you don't know what's fake. Ultimately, I promise you will. You'll know what really happened. But, you know, it's horrible to say, the butler did it. Come read the book. So trust me, you'll enjoy it. A lot of people have told me to say, don't start reading the book after 8 o'clock at night unless you have the day off the next day because you'll want to sleep in. And that is the story of this book, why I did it, how I did it. I hope you enjoy it. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
Have you visited with Mark Whitaker recently in prison?
The last time I met with Mark Whitaker in prison, well, last time I met alone with Mark Whitaker in prison was in April, March. He was subsequently interviewed by Dateline NBC, which was doing a one-hour segment based on the Informant. And Whitaker, by that point, had developed a great deal of trust in me. He had confessed a number of his lies to me. And he told me and told Dateline that he would only do the interview if I agreed to be there. And I was there. It was a very interesting experience. I wasn't doing the interview, but it was either one or two times, I don't remember which, that I had to go over to him and say, look, you have already confessed the truth to me. Are you sure? You know, he was, there's no other word for it, weaseling around a little bit. You know, he was having trouble just finally saying the words, yes, I lied about this. I said, do you want to be doing it this way, or do you want to just come out and say the whole story? And after that, he hit the table. He said, this is the whole truth. I will tell you the whole truth. And he told the whole truth.
This is a marvelous book.
Well, say that to the camera.
It is a marvelous.
It is a marvelous book. I'm sorry, I'm such a huckster. Okay. Yes.
Have you gotten any feedback from the characters in the story?
I have gotten feedback from characters in the story. Many of them have called me surprised at how accurate the book is. I did hear from Brian Shepard because he says there is one word I attributed to him which was not accurate, a swear word. And so I take him at his word. It's coming out of the next edition. Other than that, everybody has been awed, I think is the only word, just how accurate it is. Actually, the funny part was I got a call from the Chicago U.S. Attorney, Scott Lassar, and he said, I got a book, really accurate, really like it, but I've got a question for you. I said, what's that? He goes, you've got a lot of things you're not supposed to have. Where did you get them? It's like, I'm not going to tell you. So, yeah.
How long did you gather information before you were told?
Well, I was gathering information all the way through the end. I mean, I started 5 years ago, when I was just doing it for the New York Times, but I sort of a pack rat. I put boxes and boxes and boxes of material. And that reporting continued. About 3 years ago, I started on the book. And starting last July, a year ago July, I started writing it. And in the course of writing it, I would find, gee, I don't know what hotel they're in. God, I don't know what sandwich that was. I don't know who did this, where they were standing. And so I would call people back. People were amazingly patient. There was also a day, I always said no one would know this, so I'm now going to say it. There was a day where I was writing about a meeting that had taken place, and the records didn't say where it was. It said a Forsyth Hotel. It was either the Hampton Inn or the what's the one next door to it? Fairfield Inn. And I had been told in the interviews it was the Fairfield Inn. And I thought, I think I have a record on this. And I dug and dug and dug and dug and dug. And after an hour, I found this record. And no, it was the Hampton Inn. And I went and I changed one word of the manuscript and thought, who's ever going to know? But now everyone does. So. Anything else? Yeah.
What's your next project?
The question? I should be repeating the questions. I just realized I'm the only one who's mic'd. The question is, what's my next project? Trying to get people to read this book. That's going to be my job for a while. Yeah.
How long over what period of time did you speak with Mark, and did you see all these changes in his personality and character?
I first spoke with Mark Whitaker in the fall of 1995. I left that meeting convinced that I was speaking to somebody who had a psychiatric disorder. There was something that he did. He would repeat statements again and again and again and again, just like I just did. But he would say, I went to the FBI and I told them this. I told them this when I went to the FBI. And so later when I was going out, before I'd gone to the FBI already and I told them this. And I was listening to this going, this isn't normal. There's something wrong here. And I called, as a reporter, I have this huge list of experts. And I called some people and I started describing what I knew, what I was seeing, and was told he's bipolar. And it was not long after that, in a conversation, I said, have you ever been diagnosed as having a bipolar condition? And he had just been diagnosed in August. And so, Whitaker, Whitaker is a very, people have always tried to make Whitaker into a hero or a villain. And he's neither. He's both. He's everything. Whitaker, I kind of view as a tragic figure. He's a fellow who brought down an incredibly important criminal conspiracy, one that set dominoes falling again and again. They got lysine, then it went to citric acid, then it went to human vitamins, and they've collected $2 billion in fines. It's a lot of money. And all of these frauds are being broken up because of this one disturbed man. A man who was so disturbed that he could never act in his own best interest. And because of what I believe is the government's ultimate mishandling. By that I don't mean the FBI. I mean breaking the case in two, and the Justice Department fraud section handling one part, and the antitrust division handling another part. No one ever looked at Mark Whitaker as a whole human being. And so they sentenced the criminal without giving him any consideration to the fact that he had also brought down these huge conspiracies. So the result of that is you have a man who worked 2.5 years, admittedly for very twisted reasons, for very, on some levels, for very corrupt reasons, but worked for 2.5 years in exposing a crime, who got no credit for exposing that crime. And if we start demanding that cooperating witnesses and informants must be completely clean, have to come out of the convent before we agree to use them, goodbye law enforcement. Cooperating witnesses need to get credit. Of course, Mark Whitaker needed to go to jail. He committed a lot of crimes. But the fact that simply because he is too disturbed, or was during these events, to make a decision in his own best interest, hardly seems to merit him getting the kind of sentence that he received with no consideration for his cooperation. Oh, I'm sorry, that was your question, wasn't it? Did I see him deteriorate? Yes. I could pretty much predict what Mark Whitaker's lithium level was based on how he was behaving. The fall of 1996, he was at his worst stage I've ever seen him. He was completely cracking up. That was the time when a lot of material started coming out that were forgeries. He was creating bogus tapes. He was making accusations of criminal activity in the FBI. He was accusing the government of becoming communist. I mean, he was spinning so far out of control. And at that moment, he fired the only person who was actually acting in his interest. He fired Jim Epstein. And so his one sliver he had left toward getting an outcome that was going to be good disappeared. So, yeah.
I thought it was very interesting on Dateline that Special Agent Bob Herndon made the comment that he actually felt sorry for Whitaker, because if it wasn't for him, the FBI would have never, the case would have never been brought. Just exactly what you said.
Right. I mean, what she was saying is that on the Dateline program about the book, Special Agent Herndon, who was one of the case agents, said he felt sorry for I'm repeating this because I'm assuming nobody can hear it on TV. But he felt sorry for Whitaker because Whitaker received no credit for the works he did. And it's kind of hard to look at these events objectively and say, well, Mark Whitaker should get absolutely no credit for what happened. Anything else? Yeah.
So what you're saying without Mark as an informant, it never brought these other people down.
What I'm saying is that the question is what I'm saying, that without Mark as the informant, they never would have brought these people down. Without Mark Whitaker's cooperation, we would not even know that a crime was being committed. So it's beyond bringing these people down. We would be walking into our grocery stores today, buying food that is being rigged, paying more money, paying hundreds of millions, billions of dollars out of our pockets to enrich these guys who want to argue about free markets are great, competition is great, now we're going to close the door and we're all going to rig everything. So yeah, we would not know this without Mark. What was in it for Mark was, remember, it was the FBI came to talk to him. This is where you have to start. I have to start giving away the stories. The FBI came to talk to him, and I'll put it this way. He had told a number of lies. He had told lies to the FBI. His wife was pushing him to tell about the price fixing. She didn't know about the lies. If he didn't say it, his wife was going to. If he got caught in his lie, there were a series of other lies behind those that might get uncovered. Mark Whitaker was at risk of going to jail. He knew about his embezzlements at that point. He was a man talking to the FBI who had $2 million sitting in a bank account in Switzerland that he had stolen from his company. He had to distract them.
Maybe he thought that was his reward.
Maybe he thought that was his reward. On some level, he did. On some level, he did. But on some level, he also thought of it as his share of the proceeds, you know?
So there's no way for him to trade that off?
If you read the book, well, to trade that off, you mean say, I'll admit to this?
Right.
This is a man, you got to understand, this is a man who pled guilty, went to prison, served almost 3 years until he finally confessed to what the truth was. He was incapable of acknowledging what he had done. And it was only when, I'm not a threatening guy. It was only, I couldn't put him in jail, he was in jail. I couldn't do anything to him. And I just finally say, you have to embrace the truth. Your lies have not helped you. And finally, he confesses to the truth. But I'm not going to tell you what it is, because it gives away, that's the butler did it.
He's no relation to this.
He's no relation to what? Yeah.
I thought it was pretty amazing how when it did finally come to trial, where the original FBI agent, Brian Shepard, was not allowed to sit in during the trial.
I think that was pretty horrible. What the question was that he thought it was amazing that when the case finally went to trial, that the original FBI agent, Brian Shepard, wasn't allowed to sit in. The judge's ruling on that, I think, was wrong. I'm not a lawyer. I do think it was a disservice to the government, and it was a disservice to Shepard. I understand why, when faced with the choice, they had to pick one. They didn't choose Shepard. I mean, it doesn't mean anything bad about Brian Shepard. What it means is, well, Herndon is the one who has the better familiarity with the tapes. We're going to need the tape recall. Shepard is the one who knows the witness, and there was something going on with the witness at that point, which I don't want to give away, that made that much less significant. And it was just a strategic decision. The decision should not have had to been made. It was certainly not meant as an affront to Brian Shepard. But it's very hard, given the amount that Brian Shepard went through. I mean, probably a lot of you know him. Brian Shepard is a person who came into this case unwillingly. He wasn't pleased about doing it. But once it became his assignment, he pursued justice till the end. He fought against some very, very high hurdles. He had to clear a lot of high hurdles. He had people in Washington who were not working in the interest of this case. And Shepard is a credit to this community. Shepard is a credit to the FBI, because this individual, through his perseverance and through his commitment to the law, was able to ultimately knock down the first domino and put all of the bad guys in jail. And there were a lot of defendants who criticized Brian Shepard for not realizing about what there was to know about Mark Whitaker. But let me point something out. ADM didn't recognize what there was to know about Mark Whitaker. The Justice Department didn't recognize what there was to know about Mark Whitaker. The American press, when we already knew he had embezzled money, didn't recognize what there was to know about Mark Whitaker. Brian Shepard did a great job. And that is why he's one of the heroes of the book. So he's a man who did not get enough credit for what he did, for what he accomplished. Yeah.
What happened to the Japanese men, that were a part of this?
The question was what
were they punished?
The question was what happened to the Japanese the Japanese executives that were part of this? Were they punished? Well, you had a problem. The embezzlements made Whitaker into an impossible witness. They needed to introduce the tapes, but you need somebody to sit up on the stand and say, yes, that's us, I'm in that meeting, that's me, that's so-and-so, I can authenticate this tape. The only other people in the room were the Japanese, and the Japanese, ADM, if ADM had walked in the fall of 96 and say, hey, in the fall of 95 and said, your case is a disaster, we'll be the witnesses against the Japanese, that would have been hard to turn it down if they had offered a real settlement. They thought they could fight it to the end. As they're fighting, the Japanese came in and said, we'll cut a deal. We'll be your witnesses. Just don't put us in jail. We'll pay big fines. Just don't put us in jail. It's a very hard offer to walk away from because they needed to salvage the case. Salvaging the case meant, again, tipping the first domino, being able to get the evidence of all the other conspiracies that the FBI had evidence was occurring. So. Anything else? I'm sorry, I keep ignoring the people back here. Yes?
Do you think justice was served as far as the industrial conspirators?
The question is, do I think justice was served as far as the industrial conspirators? I think the law was followed. There's a Weasley answer, isn't it? No, I don't. No, I don't. If I go out tonight and I rip off a supermarket, I walk in there and I stick my hand in the cash register and steal a bunch of money, I'll probably get 6 years or something like that. These guys sat down in suits and with pens and paper, they ripped off every grocery store in America. And they got a statutory maximum of 3 years. These are cases that are very hard to prove. That's one thing you will get out of this story. They are very hard to prove. And so when you require an evidentiary level that's like this, and the FBI and the Justice Department actually manages to clear it, to then say, okay, 3 years each, is ridiculous. I'm biased. I would think that 9 years would have been appropriate. It's a serious crime. You know, anybody who reads the story in there of J.R. Hubblesrud, the farmer who was trying to open his own feed business, a man whose feed business was collapsing because the people at ADM wanted a little bit more money. Anybody who reads that and thinks that this is a victimless crime, who thinks that this is a crime that really isn't very important and shouldn't be punished, hasn't read it right. So, anything else? Oh, I've got one more over here and I keep ignoring them. Yeah. Seriously in danger? Oh, the question was how many lives were seriously in danger? I mean, there is really no, you know, one of the things, people ask me all the time because I write about white-collar crime. They go, oh, aren't you ever scared? And my response is always the same. White-collar criminals are wimps. These guys don't have guns. They aren't, you know, they could make a lot more money if they went off and murdered somebody, probably, if they could figure out the right way to do it. But they really don't engage in these things. I mean, and I have never actually, I've had people call me up and tell me, you know, when I was writing about Prudential, oh, you better pay up your Prudential life insurance, click. It's like, what a bunch of jerks. So I don't think anybody, the fact that you get a threatening call to me is usually a sign of nothing.
I didn't know about the racketeering of it, though, because that's
The racketeering really doesn't mean anything other than you've committed a crime 3 times over a period of time through an entity that can be identified as a racketeering enterprise. It's a very technical definition, but racketeering doesn't mean, you know, necessarily they're walking around with machine guns and blowing people away. It just you know, there was a securities firm up in New York where they traded a lot of times really badly, and they were breaking the law on trades, and they were indicted as racketeers. You know, there were no guns. So racketeering is just sort of a fancy phrase that says we get to take everything you own. So, yeah. Have I talked to Mick or Terry in prison? The only thing I'm not going to answer is who I've talked to unless it's actually in the book. My conversations with Whitaker are in the book, some of them. So I could talk about that, but I don't want to start going down the path of saying I talked to this guy, I didn't talk to that guy. Okay? Yeah. Yes?
Mark spent the last 5, 6 years of his life lying about everything. How do you know that sometime in the future he's not going to call you and say, hey, Kurt, this really happened instead of what I told you?
The question is basically, how can I believe Mark Whitaker's confessions now? What I established in this book, you know, when you have, Mark Whitaker wasn't the only guy who was lying. There were a lot of people lying. What I established in this book was what I called the pyramid of credibility. In other words, nobody gets a free ride. Nobody gets to say, I killed John Kennedy and I print it. You know, I have to be able to find records, documents, other material that backs up what's going on. I will give an example, okay? Sometimes you have to look at the minutia of a story. Whitaker told a story that everyone in town probably heard about being abducted. I'm going to give this one away. It's a freebie. About being abducted, that he was at the office and he was thrown into a car and driven away. And he gave some very, very specific details. He said, I was thrown into a Dodge Dynasty and the door locks were sawed off. And these guys were rough and tough and blah, 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 blah. Well, I talked to him about that and I said, door locks, what kind of door locks are you talking about? You like those push-down metal kind with the hole? He says, yeah, exactly. They were sawed off. Well, there was one thing that made me very suspicious about this whole story. One was Brian Shepard drove a Dodge Dynasty. And it was an odd car. I was just like, what an odd coincidence. So I checked. The Dodge Dynasty never was manufactured with little metal locks that go down into the hole. What they had were those, those little gripper locks that you pull up. And even if you sawed that piece off, you could still pull it up. So the car he was describing did not exist. On top of that, there is all the evidence described in the book that made it very clear. He wouldn't tell the FBI, he wouldn't repeat it. And so when I'm talking to him in prison, I say, let's talk about the abduction. He goes, okay. And he goes, oh. I said, did it really happen? No. That one was easy. And it was provable that it didn't happen. Now, that was a little proof. Some of the other ones, the final confession, which I'm obviously not telling, but the final confession, the book was written. The final confession was an extra. I wanted him to confess. I had already concluded, based on the bank records, the wires, where money went, how it went, to who, what it went from there, interviews and the rest, the interviews with the FBI, things people were saying, things people were swearing to, and the original documentation, that Whitaker's entire story had to be bogus. It made no sense. It was completely contrary to every record that existed. And so when I sat down to talk to him, I just laid all that out. And as he raised each new story, I said, I considered that. Here's what I found. He would say such things as, well, this individual called me the night before and said this was happening. How could I possibly know? I said, I considered that. When that individual testified before the grand jury, he said this, and he's a friend of yours. He contradicted you. He backed you up on everything but that. It was that kind of conversation. He didn't have any reads left. He had no support left by the time we were done. And also, got to bear in mind, this is what he told his own wife. After he was in prison, he finally said, it's not true. He didn't tell any of us. He told her. He told me second. So I kind of think at that point, if I'm hearing what his wife is hearing during their private visits in prison, and all of the evidence backs it up, I believe it. And if he comes back later and says, I was lying, I know when he's lying. It's that time, because there's no way his story is correct. You can lie. As at the end of the book, telephone records will document a call, but the meaning of the call can be twisted into anything. Bank records are solid. They say where the money went, So, anything else? Yeah. Well, is there somebody? Hold on one sec. Let me get somebody who hasn't asked a question.
Mark Whitaker was a customer of ours, and many times he'd call in reference to his car repairs, and he'd tell my husband that he was over the ocean, going such and such a place to see about his car. And then when we talked to him another time, it was something different.
This is a person saying, this is somebody who had dealings with Mark Whitaker, who said Mark Whitaker would call to have his car, when he was asking questions about his car, and saying he was over the ocean and flying somewhere, and then later he would tell the same story and it would be something different. You know what? I've really gone over time, haven't I? You know what? I'm going to take 3 more questions, and then I'm going to sign your books. So.
Are you at liberty to? We heard all we did was hear what he's doing now that he's in prison. I have wondered if that's really what he's doing.
The question is, what is he doing in prison? He is working on a tractor. He is doing work at the prison, and that's his job is driving the tractor. Okay, 2 left. Oh, maybe we're done.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Were there any signs of his personality problems prior to him coming to Decatur, to ADM?
Subtle. Were there any signs of Whitaker's problems prior to coming to Decatur? Subtle signs, very subtle signs. The kind that you just look at and say, well, this is a quirky guy. Not signs you would look at and say, well, that he's everything that he has now been shown to be. And so you would just think that he was eccentric, nothing else. Last question. You want a second one?
I changed my mind.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that, no? I guess that's it. Folks, I want to thank you all very much. You've been a great crowd. I also want to thank the people at Walden Books in Forsyth, Illinois, who set this up, who allowed us to sit down and talk about this case. They did a wonderful job, and I can't thank them enough. And now, anyone who would like a book, I will sign. Now remember, they get first dibs, because I had my back to them almost the whole time.